I was so happy last night to see Plato, not necessarily because of the allegory of the cave, which depresses me, but because I thought of Plato's symposium and the symposium that this is, and the coining of the term symposium in Plato comes from a discussion, a dinner that he has basically, where he gets drunk with a bunch of friends and uses this word symposium to describe this discussion with friends. And it's at the symposium that he comes to his version of Platonic love, and which I'd like to extend that metaphor to this symposium and say that, you know, at least we're going to have a discussion right now. It's a discussion among some like-minded peoples, but no commitment, okay? And so I like to think of this as colleagues with benefits. And my colleagues with benefits today are Anna Neimark of First Office, who is faculty at SCI-Arc, Andrew Zago, Zago Architecture, faculty at SCI-Arc, Peter Trummer, who is and faculty at—
I'm not so sure about that, if I know.
Yeah, well, enough. At SCI-Arc, Florencia Pita of FP Mod and Pita and Bloom, faculty at SCI-Arc, and Jimenez Lai of Bureau Spectacular, who is not faculty at SCI-Arc. But it's okay. That's fine. And I want to also say thank you to Hernan Diaz Alonso, who pushed this to happen, whether we liked it or not, for Tom. Thank you to Tom and to Todd for doing all of this organizing. Thank you to Stephanie and Reza for the material factors of everything that you see here. When I, like the others, when I received my panel title to provoke, they told me first I was not a panel discussant or a moderator, I was a provocateur, and that I was to provoke on character, posture, and legibility. And I thought, crap, I'm on the postmodernism panel. And
Posture.
Right. Well, no, it's impossible. We're having sort of Miesian posture here.
I'm being corrected with my posture.
Oh, you're
I thought, crap, I got the postmodernism panel, and I don't have, really anything to maybe say about that. And I was a bit worried, how do I not talk about postmodernism if it's going to be as kind of elephant in the panel, if you will? And then I realized that maybe that was an unfair characterization, and it was around the word character that the characterization, I think, the play on those two terms became evident to me. That when we look at, say, the history of character, posture, those tend to be words that we use to describe figures, and how that's contrasted necessarily with the idea of legibility, which is more of an account of cognition through reading or text, if you will. And so there's a history to these things. There's a history to these concepts having been brought together here at this moment, or having been taken apart through the kind of longue durée of art and art concept, as well as architectural theory. And what I would say is that it's a kind of tearing asunder of the object versus the technique. And the majority of discussions about this were actually discussions about aesthetics. They were discussions about what's beautiful coming out of the Enlightenment, what's beautiful, what's sublime. And then eventually discussions about what is proper or what is correct, or what is the technique for creating that beautiful or sublime thing without a lot of room, shall we say, in the aesthetic world for the possibility of other, say, aesthetic categories. And so when I think about character, if we can go forward, okay, there. So when confronted with the word character, my mind immediately goes to these drawings by Lavater to describe, using the silhouette or the outline of faces, the physiognomy of these figures in order to describe their emotional or mental characteristics, for better or for worse. And then obviously this has been used for the alibi of all types of evil perpetuated in the world. And so the Lavater drawings, which were kind of passed over, reappear during the, say, critical period of architecture. And can I go to the next slide? As opposed to this Lavater drawing, which is signaled more as a kind of animal becoming, which I think is where we are now in terms of the contemporary. And so the unfair characterization for me of going, oh crap, the postmodern, was probably also because I had a kind of fear of criticality and wanting to move this, as the Lavater drawings have moved into a more contemporary discussion. Next drawing, or next thing. The other, and I think Jimenez, this is something that that has been called attention to you, is the other aspect is that the encounter with these questions of the propriety or correctness of the aesthetic and how to, say, draw out the aesthetic in the thing is also something that through history gets increasingly codified or increasingly made into the book, or in this case this book of grammar by Charles Blanc. And then here, you can just hold on this one too for a minute. Thank you. This grammar was exactly the book that Seurat apparently used in order to start to develop the techniques and therefore believe in, say, the systematization of color in order to do the types of paintings that he did. And so this sense that we can, kind of create correct techniques, and that those correct techniques will deliver a certain kind of aesthetic that is judged as good, is something that has been pervasive, and whether there's a normal or not. And I think Ferda's discussion in the last session was quite interesting about, well, maybe there's not a normal. There is at least a kind of historical normal of a tendency toward normalization, which is in these texts. When I told Todd that I was going to show an image from Charles Blanc, he says, you need to show images from Mel Blanc, Mel being the person who illustrated Bugs Bunny cartoons. And clearly, I think that we're moving not only against this codification, but towards something that is probably going to, or is demanding of us to not only rethink the relationship, say, between the object and this technique or the process, but also the aesthetics themselves. So on that, I want to provoke a little further by bringing up Victor Shklovsky, who is becoming kind of trendy, and his essay on the artist technique, but 1925, I think this is, in which he talks about wanting to increase the difficulty and the length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself. And then he uses the phrase, and it must be prolonged. It needs to be prolonged, that there's something that has to happen that lengthens that. And I think that some of our discussions some of the discussions that have been going on over the past little while have been, trying to get at like, well, what is this defamiliarization? What is this strangeness? How do we get to weirdness? How do we get to this kind of, way in which the object is no longer apprehendable? And so while Shklovsky rejects the object, and that's a different discussion, I like this idea of slowing down. And I like this idea of that's been kind of roaming around here, this fondling of details. It's a little bit, to me, the discussion of close reading and the value of close reading and, getting into the thing that we get into. But I think that the value of that, the prolongation, so forth, is not in order to discover its universal truths or its grammars, but maybe to uncover this complex new aesthetics that are pushing on us. So one of these, what I'm saying, these complex new aesthetics, I want to provoke by suggesting that this is not defamiliarization, that it's very familiar, if anything, over familiar, a lot of familiarities at once, a kind of multiple of familiarities. Maybe the Borgia quote was apropos to that. And that the aesthetic language that we have for it is just insufficient to any of these encounters that we have. So read somebody like Sion Nagai, say, or Kotsko, Adam Kotsko, and you get to aesthetics that are more than just one, the absolute, the beautiful, or the fearful of the sublime. There are things like weak aesthetics that are produced through ambivalence. That ambivalence produced because on one hand, it's like consumer culture is a negative on one hand. On the other hand, you have feelings of tenderness toward the thing that you see. You're experiencing a kind of multiple of sensations, and all of those sensations are feeding into our aesthetic sensibility. So I'm going to run the work of the people who are sitting here. It's going to just kind of keep going manually because there are so many different mediums that people contributed. And I'm going to ask a couple of really on-the-spot questions. So, first question, cute or no cute?
No cute.
No cute? No? Andrew?
No cute.
No cute.
I'd say we're all very cute. We're the cutest panel.
We are the cutest panel.
That's true.
Yeah, so I'd say yes.
It's tough, actually.
Come on, Peter is very
Come
guy.
on, come on. You look great.
I know. I say yes.
Florencia, cute? No
Yeah.
cute.
I mean, if you have beauty, you have sublime, you need cute.
Yeah.
You want it alternative.
Cute. So Jimenez.
Yeah, for sure cute.
Cute.
Yes.
I mean, I think cute is a kind of abstraction, right? You make a friendly cat into a Hello Kitty, and that's really important to communicate that way. Make something fun and approachable and soft.
But it's not just fun and approachable and soft, because Hello Kitty is also very much a sort of consumer little, I mean, there's Hello Kitty stores and Sanrio, handbags, right? So it's not, I mean, cute is never really just cute. So if you're going to be cute,
I think cute can also be dark. So for example, Doraemon, the famous Japanese comic series, if you read into the subtext, it's actually a very sad and very dark story, even though it's super cute. And I find that interesting, when something can communicate both.
Yeah. Okay. So does cute have to be like small? Like, I mean, is it? Is cute like this? It's helpful if it's small.
It's coming from a very small person.
You're really cute.
I thought that Austrians are weird people, yeah?
Yeah.
But what I experienced the last days here, There's nothing.
Well,
No, but what I mean, no, you see why I would say no cute is no is, you see, it's not for me about that something should be recognized from me, yeah, to see in that, yeah. So why I'm saying it's not cute is because for me I cannot access it as a cuteness, you know, because then I would describe qualities that I would know what cute means, you know. So I would then have an understanding what effect I want to achieve. You know? Why I'm saying no cute is because I'm interested in something that I don't know, yeah, what it means, it is, refers to. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So, and why I'm saying that is probably have to talk about this shortly, because you see, when you talk character, you know, that it means there's something that I can recognize. Yeah, I should see a face. I should recognize something in that, yeah? But for example, my university was rebuilt, yeah? And there was a window, yeah? And I thought I know what windows are, yeah? But that window looked really funny because you couldn't look outside anymore. You couldn't open it because there was a motor, you know, it goes yeah? Closing, yeah? But then, because of security reasons, you know, people could basically go. It was then sheltered with a grid, so no wind went through. Yeah? And then, when the authorities passed by, and I said to them, "Why can I not open the window?" They said, "Mr. Trummer, this window is not for you. It's for the building." Yeah?
Yeah.
So I think that's where I think no cute. No cute means there is an architecture today, yeah, that is not for us.
Wait, do you think that the building has tender feelings for its window?
I think more or less I love when buildings are cute to buildings. Yeah.
Yeah. So you.
I think there is a.
So you do think cute, but it's not for you. It's for.
I'm not interested anymore what I think of architecture.
Ah.
I'm getting more and more interesting what architecture thinks to architecture.
Yeah. This is.
Whoa.
Well, what do you think that?
Oh,
What do you think of
I
that,
think
Andrew?
Peter's going to take a far more radical stand than I will during this, and so I'm going to just tip my hat. Can we go back? I wanted to just have a recall vote though on
Okay, here we go.
abstraction versus the abstract. I would like to recall that topic if I had anything to do with introducing it. So,
Wait, what do you want to recall it for?
as a topic of general, a kind of overarching topic in these things. It has too many facets that are overlapping to be useful as a kind of floating topic in a talk like this.
Go for it.
Okay.
Okay.
Go for
All
it.
right.
Go for it.
I'm still trying to figure out the window that's not for
I didn't bring
that's
it
not
up.
for
You
people.
brought it up.
I know.
So, yeah.
No, because I think at some point when we're talking about the ideas of legibility, you know, it's not abstract and abstraction doesn't mean much if the window's for the building and not for people, right? This would be a different thing. I think there's the postmodern suspicion that you have about some of the work is that I assume because there's a number of things probably represented by people on this panel that if you look at it, you can kind of see what it is. And the idea that work should no longer architecture should no longer not look like anything, but should in fact look like something was a kind of one of the defining ambitions of postmodernism. So I think when you see it now, this looks like not only postmodernism, a kind of neo-postmodernism. And I think that probably is true, and it probably is a certain kind of tendency that's floating around architecture, maybe even in some corners of this group. But I think there's other reasons. The cute is an unusual topic. You would run screaming away from that if you were if you were a modernist painter. You would not be looking at Walt Disney and trying to take lessons from that, right? From Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse. I think we're in a different situation where we understand exactly the slightest change of curvature of a thing, and then suddenly it becomes a face. suddenly becomes a figure, suddenly it's legible or not legible, that rather than trying to escape it, there's a different kind of attempt towards the abstract if we want to do it, or let's say a suspension of reading of what the project is by strategically employing various qualities, sort of using kind of the incredible power of legibility and even the slightest hint of it as a way of setting up a different kind of spatiality, a different kind of, I don't know if aesthetic is the right word, but let's say a different sensibility. Because maybe I think maybe at some level I would even be conservative enough to imagine that maybe aesthetics could be seen as universal and eternal. But the sensibility and the tools through which one gets to that, I think, changes. And I think in our times actually changes at an alarming rate. And so suddenly, I think we find ourselves, or at least I do, using some very sometimes questionable means, suspicious and maybe against people's better judgment, myself included, in order to try to keep ahead of this difficulty of getting at the suspension of clear reading, legibility, stylistic conventions.
But I'm super scared of what you're saying, honestly, because it sounds to me...
I'm more scared of what Peter's saying, frankly.
But the reason that it is because it puts us in a position as being constantly having to walk a tightrope. Yesterday, Tom Wiscombe said, if something becomes too legible, I dial it down, and if it becomes too formless, I dial it back up, as if like this is the kind of tightrope that we're being asked to walk on continuously on into the contemporary world of architecture, and I don't want to believe that that's the game.
I don't. Well, I would say, and I thought it was also interesting when Tom was saying that, and this is something I think about, but I think looking around, I think you could find other ways in which similar sorts of things are played out, even in other practices and even in other art forms. I don't think this is a new theory of architecture. I think it is a contemporary tactic that works. So I don't know, I wouldn't want to claim more for it than that.
Do you want to... I don't know. I mean, I think your work is being addressed here a little bit, right? Because, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, like, insta recognition that goes on with your work, and, there's... And it's looping now, so... Do you want to throw in right here?
I mean, if you wrote an essay and with no references, it's kind of impossible, I think, to have a conversation with, let's say, previously existing literature, or even, producing some kind of resonance with someone else who might be reading your essay, which is why I think quotation is not only unavoidable, but academic. And I think, so to call a work postmodern simply because it tips its hat at, previously existing conversations is kind of unfair, first of all, I think.
You think it's short-sighted?
It's a little bit, yeah. Just because somebody likes to, make quotes doesn't mean it's postmodern. I don't think so.
Right, right. Like, just like a gridded thing doesn't necessarily make something, quote, modern.
I don't think so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's fair. But I also think that it seems to me that the stakes need to be so enormously different now, right? That if we say postmodern, what we're referring to is we're referring to a kind of intentional blurring of categories in order to challenge a status quo. But I think now we don't necessarily have the same feeling for a status quo. We don't have a kind of the man that we're fighting against in the same way. And instead, I think that there's a much more multiple way of being in the world that makes it such that, I don't know whether there's a universal aesthetic or not, naming the kind of multiple way of seeing that. So for example, I mean, in your work, Anna, there's a lot of like at first it appears very simple, right? At first it appears very sort of existentially straightforward. At first it appears as if there's a kind of very clear legibility, this thing to this thing, white to white, the corner to the corner, and you even name it things like that, couch on couch, right? Table on table. And, but then the more door, there's a door, it was Duchamp door, right? It's said of the Duchamp door. But the closer you get to it, the more that it starts to fluctuate and change, and you see the concave thing becoming the convex thing, and the more kind of, you don't have a sort of sequence of referentiality. You don't have, all you can do is bring what you thought were an orderly way of looking at it prior to that, and then now it's completely exploded by looking absolutely normal.
It is what it is most of the time, and I'm actually kind of surprised that our conversation became a bit serious because I don't know. I look at some of the work that we all do, and much of it is quite interactive. It invites a really strange set of audiences. I think that when we spoke seriously in the past, our audience was we had 5 people who were listening. Now, hopefully, there are 12. I don't, but there is, and this kind of maybe comes back to embracing some of these adjectives like cute or I don't know, something that's very familiar, very much common ground, or stock detailing, let's say, that allows for a kind of conversation to occur right away, so that some of these models that are moving through are precisely very interactive, and they are dollhouses and things that you can put together, take apart, flip upside down, and they're they kind of try to be exactly what as they are.
Can I ask a question? On top of this kind of feeling like aesthetic is a multiple thing at this point, and I think we have agreed to disagree on that, does detail have a scale anymore? I mean, really, Peter, I would say this, I was looking at this, I was talking about fondling details, being attentive to those things, right? But you do a door that looks like a door, but it's not a door, it's a model, right? And Florencia, you have a whole bunch of scalar shifts in your work, and Peter, you're dealing with things at the level of the city that are still, I think, cute. You guys are all
scaling.
Well,
1-to-1.
1-to-1.
Things meet 1-to-1. There's no scaling.
But is there a scale of detail that's appropriate to architecture? I mean, in other words, we think of scaling in architecture as belonging to the material thing that it belonged to, right? So that the corner is faithfully reproduced in terms of an exact measurement of a corner. But now there's the model and the virtual, the rendering and so forth have made it such that we don't necessarily have the same idea that the detail has to belong to, say, just this little piece right here, right? That the detail could actually be something as large as a wash, say, I like that your work is being shown right now. Yeah.
So now I have to talk.
Yeah.
But, no, I don't know. I mean, we can talk about detail, but I mean, I think there's something that came out of your presentation. It will relate to detail, I promise, Dora. But I also have to do with, I'm really glad that Andy brought his carton, collages. Because there's something that is, for me, is interesting that also has to do with the presentation by Marcelin that he made. He brought a quote from Funes el Memorioso by Borges, and the idea that there's no big narrative, there's like a lot of, I mean, you mentioned close reading. I mean, he's so obsessed with every detail, remembering everything for what it is, that there's no big picture. That I think that something that I found interesting is that it's almost as if the details become, you know, they proliferate. So there are elements, and that for me relates to abstraction as well. So in using the example of Andy's cereal boxes, and then you show how it is applied to the buildings and so on. It's almost as there's no scalar shift. You know, our work is similar in that sense. You know, almost as if it's in the search of something. You know, in like Funes, in like the constant search of more information or new information. He cannot, you know, he cannot see emptiness. And in a way, I think that a lot of the material that we're like recycling, you know, so why it has a kind of sense of postmodernism. I think it has to do with a kind of mixture that you find, you know, and so it comes acute, you know, trying to bring a new aesthetics that is not, it doesn't belong to the realms of like, you know, how you try to find the horrific, the beautiful, the sublime, but you actually start to kind of uncover new territories, and the new territories are found in the everyday, cereal boxes or cartoon characters, you know, colors from, you know, kind of culture. And so I think, you know, almost as if this thing, the pure imagination of Funes, of like everything gets mixed up. The small details with the big elements, you know, and so it becomes this really rich ground of research, you know, and kind of material information. Same case as Peter, you know, like the image of the city becomes part of the city itself. It's all found stuff. The door of Anna, I thought it was a big door. I just saw your hand and I realized.
It was built to.
Oh, here we have I love this, you know, these images. So, you know, and you can read, you know, you can almost see Kellogg, and you know, I mean, you can get the big picture and the kind of close up.
Right.
I want to maybe kind of build on this thought of you can almost read. I really like this idea of you can almost read, you can kind of read. And so maybe coming back to the word legibility and whether or not there's mystery to the novel. And I'm the kind of guy that likes mystery to a novel. I think I enjoy suspense in a film that I'm watching. And therefore I don't necessarily want to know for sure exactly what the message is. And so you can kind of read, I think, is a really interesting way to think about, let's say, a kind of abstraction in some ways.
Isn't it frustrating a little bit? I mean, my daughter is 5, so she's exactly at that moment of, I cannot read quite yet. I can almost read. And so there's always this question of asking a parent to help her to read. What would that translate into in this kind of case?
I mean, you know, let's say if we can't read, which in maybe from the 800 to 1600 Europe, it would be paintings maybe to help us or help people understand what the stories are supposed to be talking about. And so a kind of graphic representation of communication and language, I think, you know, in a two-dimensional setting is in our tradition for a very, very long time. And that's the kind of story where, you know, it's not just the exactness of the language, it's also the environment of what's being represented, which I think you lose information and therefore abstraction begins, where you gain information because you read something that wasn't there.
But isn't that, it seems such a crap, I don't know, it's a bad place, I feel like, because it's different for, you know, saying, okay, well, there isn't a legibility, and so, you know, you're going to introduce some means by which that happens for better or for worse, versus a kind of intentional illegibility, just enough to create, I mean, you know, are we Stephen King? Is that it? You know, we're going to create these little masterful suspenses, and that's the end goal of what architecture should be in the world?
Well, but you're talking about formats. I mean, it seems like rather than forms, and it seems that rather than a form being merely legible, in this case, the format becomes the kind of graphic novel, right?
But I want to, so just, there were a couple, I think there were several interesting things that were brought up. last night. One we already talked about was, you brought up, Dora, in terms of the thing Tom was saying about the dial, the legibility, which is, I think it's let's say the impulse towards that, the hunch about that, I think is important. I think relates to what we're talking about. I think also relative to this discussion, maybe this was Elena's point when she was talking about narrative and asking whether isn't this really putting, I may be phrasing it, wasn't that really then putting architecture to the service of literature? And I think that's true, and I think that's not architecture's job to do that. It can do that, obviously, but that's not our first calling. And then the other one was something that Marcelo was talking about, because part of the confusion about abstraction is talking about drawings, and a drawing is an abstraction, and that's a very interesting and important topic, but I think that takes us off into a different territory. That's one of the things that I wanted to sort of unpack from that. If we can put that question aside for a minute, it has to do, this. I think Marcel was talking about one of his renderings, which were quite interesting, and this thought that at least it just makes this thing show up there, that you have the real world, and suddenly this other thing that is somewhat inexplicable would appear. And I think that idea of the inexplicability is, to my mind, the abstract. It was also, it's very nice and a little touching to hear Tom also bringing up Bahram Shardel, who's my former colleague, a teacher, former faculty here. I have someone, Spike here, to attest, who worked for us back in the dark ages. And I think this was really, I'm really borrowing that distinction from him when he would talk about abstraction versus the abstract. And this was in the days of postmodernism, and this was, that notion of the abstract was to counter the idea of legibility.
Right.
That a work of architecture is something that one reads. That instead it's simply one has an intelligent encounter with it that is pre-legibility. It's not about it's not an argument that one unpacks, but rather it is as we would say, a thing simply in and of itself. So that difference is, we know this, like pre-modernism, you would have, paintings, Christian paintings would have an iconographic set of symbols within it that one would read. Architecture may have certain technical achievements that one might want to study and be fascinated by. Architecture may have a kind of history of languages and references and quotations, that what it makes. We understand that this is part of it, but this is a sort of secondary, these are the secondary attributes of art. It is actually the immediate experience of it, which is again this is my conservative read on it, which comes first. The problem with postmodernism is you had quite a few people that wanted to reverse that and say that the actual immediate form and space experience of it is really a secondary quality. It's more about reading it and understanding the quotations, understanding, or whatever it is, the engineering of it, the sociology of it, the history of it. And so that notion then, in the early 20th century, that was the attempt to escape it was through reduction. So when we're talking about abstraction, this is really to say, I will one by one surgically remove anything that seems to be like anything. And that's just not a tenable position anymore. That kind of abstraction, that kind of minimalism is itself caught up in a kind of legibility. And so, at least in my own work, and I don't know if this is what Tom was getting at as well, it's there as a way of, trying to not let it ever quite resolve itself. The issue of legibility, not to keep it as a mystery, but to make it ineffective.
I want to ask also something, and that is very, very personal, because it's not for me, it doesn't matter for me, postmodernism, but from a European viewpoint, and that's my understanding, it was always also about what is legitimate to the kind of subject I am in the relation to the city. And so why I'm a little bit uncomfortable is only that even Zizek said the 20th century is over. Yeah? What I mean by that is, for me, there was always a certain search of the legitimate in their own subject as an author, but also what a building should communicate to the subject as a common. Yeah? Now, I only think that is in the core of questioning. Yeah? I think what I hear throughout the days, if this is triple O of speculativism, is really that there might not be something for which we produce architecture in a certain essence for. Yeah? Because when I see postmodernism, whatever, it was about what is more legitimate. Yeah? Is it, let's say, Aldo Ross's idea of the analog city, that the history is right? Is it more right the cuteness of the Venturi who says, I'm producing local signifiers? Is it the right that one says, of Wolff, I close my eyes, draw because my inner subject will make the building, It was over, or what I'm using in my little diagram, this idea that one says, no, there's the autonomy of form, that is the only essence, and here's the autonomy of the event, like Kohlhaas, yeah? And I see postmodernism as a question always of that search of a subject. But I think today, and this is, I think, why I brought this example of the window,
Right.
there is broadly that subject in total question. Yeah?
Yeah.
And that's why I think I'm unfriendly with this idea of postmodernism, because it always looks like as if I should be able to read something. But the city or the buildings are probably much more crazier than we can imagine. I mean,
I agree.
Some of my research in cities, when we build cities without roads, no one living there, but money, has produced them. Yeah? We make high-rises that cost 30 million, no one can afford them, but they are produced. So there is a production of architecture that is beyond what it means to us. And I think that's where I think we have to question what kind of subject are we in relationship to architecture?
Right.
And that's why I start to like architecture.
Right. Well, because
more than someone's particular idea.
you would assume that we're sort of we're coming into a kind of post-cogito moment.
Or at least that's what I feel, the idea that is happening in philosophy and other things, or the weird stuff is, because when I don't know what the real is,
Right.
when I don't have an access to it, the thing is, what is it then that we are doing? Yeah?
Yeah, so the subject has always been assumed as being not only sufficient but masterful of their surroundings, right? Such that anything can become a text. Now we're in a point where the subject is probably insufficient to that.
Means we mistrust the subject. I mean, my idea of the 20th century is mistrust. As a European, I'm really getting sick that every country in Europe thinks I know what Europe is, The Roman says we are Europe because we have invented the law, And the Greek says, no, we have invented the public space. The German says, no,
Imagine how I feel as a
we pay for
Jew.
that,
Yeah.
And the French said, no. And the French says, no, we are the one because we invented democracy. I am fed up with this. There is something that is beyond someone's accessibility. And that, I think, will raise the question to what architecture is. Yeah? And I found that as an interesting idea, an architecture without a legitimate subject. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Well, but I think architecture just even with an insufficient subject in the sense that in my mind, I don't think that we need to go out of our way to produce complexity with buildings. I think buildings are already extremely complex. I think, anything like the interior corner problem is already complex enough without needing to kind of, add to this extra illegibilities to make it kind of more fascinating than it need be.
Are you asking also a question not only about the subject occupying the city, but also about the author behind it? In other words,
I think we will have to touch that in a certain way, because you see, let's give an example. When I described that window, that window never had thought. No one had thought of that window. Yeah, it's what Zizek once said. We are not in the society of that we know what we want to do or that we know what we should do. We do it because we can. Yeah, and so this window is because some Germans found a motor. Yeah, figured it out that it can fit in the window. Yeah. Then the security system said we have to make a panel, and here it is. Here it is. And the thing is, with its appearance itself, it basically questions, everything. The author, and that comes then in the regime of sustainability, because the building should breathe in the night by itself.
Well, performance
you should even
is
see
one,
it.
right.
Some of my assistants, they made videos in the night. So in the evening, the window doesn't know, should I open or close? So it goes like, And I think that this is not only funny, I think that really erased my idea, what is it to me as an author? And so that became a little bit the kind of belief that I said, why cannot be architecture the author? Now, I don't know what it means, but I think that's what I'm getting really...
Peter, let me ask you, and because I
don't shoot me now. It's
no,
more like a...
not at all. Not at all.
I'm just a simple man.
I've
I'm a simple man.
Never shot anyone in a symposium,
Yeah,
so I'm not about to
You
start
don't
now.
start. Yeah.
No, because I think the point you're making is extremely compelling, and what I would ask, and I'm not saying this in any kind of cynical way, in what way is this, and then what?
Okay.
I mean, what is the action that one would?
Yeah, I don't have the answer. I just wanted to raise that. Let's say it conflicted me, and I think it's an interesting. Two things also. Why I like the building is because there is something more in the building than just an author. I mean, this is my old Losian thing. It is made by many. It is for many. There is a client. There's much more to that. I think that's one thing. And the other is that. Our role in how we bring, I cannot say what the immediate effect will be, but it definitely will be something that questions, our theories in the means of what has been talked the other day, what representation, abstraction, things mean. It will question that,
I'm just kind of trying to figure out also how to...
Look at your door, yeah? That is a little bit... Has a door thought that it can have to open? Look at it.
That was the question that Duchamp posed. I think the question that we may have posed was, what would an architect do with this object, with this kind of found object? But I guess I'm trying to figure out where to go with this, because I believe that this is a very important conversation for our students, especially those who go into thesis, and to think of it in that context where authorship is something that becomes diffused into the way in which I guess the kind of certain instruments of architecture act back upon it. So in your case, it could be a kind of...
I was reading before, authorship, I thought it comes up, so they say...
You have your cliff notes in the back. I don't have any cliff notes. I'm thinking
We were especially told not to prepare.
But you see, if authorship is about this kind of individuation through oeuvre of work, I can understand that you do it if you write something, or something like this. But there is a production of architecture that is beyond you as an author. Now, the only thing what I like, and what this whole speculative reason, whatever it did, is it made us look to buildings as such differently again. Instead of saying, I have a means of what the essence of a building is, by either a formalist, analyst, or whatever, I'm thinking, what if you are not an author, but you are a mediator, of the ideas of architecture? Because if you look at architecture as a disciplinary idea, you could say it's just the assembly, that there was always a pre-building before another building, There was always something pre-occurring another building before, There was not something someone came and geniusly figured it out. So in that's where I'm somehow getting...
But Peter, we don't have a discourse of buildings. We have a discourse of writing on building.
Wait.
Well, remember the tyranny of the idea, Ungar's quote that you brought.
I put myself now in a slippery ground, but let's think of it. I totally agree that until now I would have had the discipline of architecture as a discipline of ideas. But that buildings that come together, or the designs that come together, not only have one rational, conscious author. They have a history of authors. They have a history of buildings. They have something we might not even know. And so that's why I'm saying there might be much more to the thing we see what a building is, yeah, than we want it to be. And that's why I think I want to pick up, to see, can we learn something from a building as such, and see how it can mutate to the other.
Maybe one way I'd engage it in the following way, that it's also a history of technologies, and it's also a history of certain types of instruments, and that, to come back to the way in which we think through thesis, because the thesis is the place where we think authorship should play itself out somehow, at least within a kind of pedagogical context, that maybe to know thyself is to know your instruments, or at least your means of production, and to begin to understand the kind of, to quote another text, the artist as producer, to understand the tools with which we operate more carefully. And then, I would agree then that there is a kind of erasure of the self.
One of the things that I really like about Los Angeles, I've been here 4 days to the date. It'll be one year of living in LA for me. So I've been really liking it so far. And one of the things I really like is maybe the general attitude of people. People here, and this is my reading, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, people work super hard. People work incredibly hard. But people have this social thing that they do. They want to look like they're not working hard. It's a thing that I'm noticing about like a culture of LA, and it's also maybe a curbing of expression of self, or curbing of self-pain, because the appearance of pleasure seems to be something that's in the air in LA, and so this kind of management of ego in some ways, people don't want to look selfish, and people don't want to talk about their own pain. But then again, I think in thesis time, where any person who's doing work, inevitably you're doing work that's you, and it's because unless Skynet takes over, architecture is not going to have self-awareness.
But I think, Peter, and I think it's good that you mentioned it, how, with our audience, through the scenes, how the issue of authorship and the subject from the point of view of designer, as a designer or as an inhabitant of architecture, and your belief in the disappearance of inhabitants with zombie urbanism, that paints a picture already of what you think of, the subject inside of a building, on, that it's like it's something you would never expect, but that's what's happening today. So I think, and then going back to Anna's notion of, in certain way, authorship, it's somehow eradicated through technique, or almost as if the tools themselves own authorship. And I think, so, which is another problem of subjectivity. How do you control the techniques in order to bring back, the author as the main, the driver? And it reminds me a little bit to what happens to classical music. We've seen a lot of clips about contemporary music and how, they borrow more than they create.
Right.
And in classical music, it's about, continuing something. It's not about innovation, not at the point of novelty, but at the point of technique, and then an interpretation of the tools. So one thing that it could also be about authorship, and it is that how do you advance the tools through interpretation, so you still don't have, which I think, that's why I wanted to keep on coming back to the larger discussion these 2 days on the issue of the issue of figuration and abstraction. This is the one group that actually has a move more closer to figuration, or legibility, as you can call it, and not lack of authorship, but sometimes, novelty doesn't come from newness, but actually kind of reinterpretation. And I think that Peter's question of what's the subject, do you actually have to assume the subject is always the same? The window doesn't belong to anybody, neither the designer nor the inhabitant. And the same thing happens with the tools for design. It's like you don't own the tools of design, but how do you advance them? So there's no authorship there, but there's, advancement of the technique, and then it becomes some sort of, authorship, in that sense. Or the better that you can advance the technique, the biggest, the mastery of the authorship that you can make of something that is really ubiquitous right now.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up classical music, because it's a kind of automation of ghosts from 400, 500 years ago. They wrote it, right? But then somehow when I listen to Glenn Gould, the pianist, who plays the piano, actually, not even violin, I could tell that Glenn Gould is playing somehow. And therefore...
And Marta Argerich, it's not, you've heard the same tapes.
Yes.
By different, and it's like they acquire their character, through repetition, so endless repetition of.
But is there now, there seems to be a creeping Gestaltism that's coming because of this interest in figures and maybe misrecognizing figures and so forth, that I feel like I should be deferring to cognitive psychologists sometimes in architecture and say, well, I don't know if it's a figure or not, you tell me, you do a study of, N people or such. But I don't think it is the same. It's not supposed to be the same, right? Gestalt is the, there's a figure and a ground and a
about, I think,
good and a bad.
when you were describing the window and its relationship with whether or not in the middle of night should I be closing or opening, I think to me you're describing a kind of self or a personality. Like it's beginning to become a personality. Like there's a hesitation of the architecture and whether or not the content of architecture generates personality by its plan or elevation or installation of windows or its mass. And sometimes I think the mass could produce personality, and and let's say the exactness of the personality is just kind of silly to define, actually. Right. When we see a lot of architecture that has too exact a personality and suddenly it's really not interesting.
But when you listen to the music, you don't sit there and say, I wonder if this is music that I'm listening to, as opposed to people, and especially the world of lay people out there who see the figures in the architecture and say, oh, look at the bunny, look at the lobster, or whatever else the case may be, and they're not like second guessing whether or not they're listening to music, say, right? So I don't think that it's an exact parallel in that way, because I think the subjective cognitive relationship is not the same with the building as it would be.
I think it can be simplified to what you say, but I think it's a lot more complex, or at least somehow interesting. Mm-hmm. And I was preparing for one of my classes, a piece by Wölfflin called "The Linear and the Painterly." Okay. And what is interesting about that text is that it goes from the figure to abstraction. It's the kind of first, and he's mentioning how Rembrandt is the first abstract painter, right. Let's say. Right. And the way in which for me, Rembrandt is a little bit the comment that Tom Wiscombe said yesterday. It's like, I dial it back or not, right. So Rembrandt is right there. It's like, and the way in which he's actually not linear is because there's no black outlines. There's no outlines within his form. You can still recognize it's highly figurative, his face. But there's this kind of blur figure that starts to happen. So it seems that all of this work, it uses it's in that edge, you still can recognize some of the figures, but it tries to absorb a little bit of the edges of abstraction,
We have one minute then, and I want to go around with a couple of these again. So the cute, that question, and I have it: outline or no outline?
Rembrandt, no outline. Yeah.
Outline.
It really depends on the situation.
Ooh, situational outline.
Yes.
It sounds like Donald Trump policy, right? Situational outline. Okay, outline or no outline?
I love architecture.
Okay.
Both. Exactly both.
Weighted the same. Okay. Outline or no outline?
I kind of don't care.
Okay.
I don't know if...
Okay, I can go to my next one with you.
I have a question.
Corner or no corner? hard corner or soft corner? Meaning, do you want to soften the edge?
I don't have a position on any of
You
them.
don't have a position on corners?
I guess when you guys were talking about music, I was thinking, when we started with Shklovsky, who was a literary formalist, and I kept thinking of John Cage and his work also in poetry. And I would say that there are questions that are on the table now that have to do not with technique as a kind of advancement of technology moving forward, but technique as it belongs to kind of background of the work, in the same way that kind of Cage talked about the background of language, let's say. So I don't think that I'm able to directly answer to purely geometric questions of
Okay, let me ask
line,
a
corner.
last
I mean,
question.
these things are kind of
Last question. This is Spinal Tap. He puts the volume at 11. The dial, right? The volume's at 11. Where's the volume at for you?
For Spinal Tap.
For you,
I drive in
your
my
work.
car and I turn the
For
music
you and
off.
for you and your work.
No music
no.
in the studio.
Andrew,
I don't have an answer to that.
You don't-
I'm at zero.
zero.
Zero architecture.
Zero. Right? Yeah, and this is your diagram, right? This is exactly
Zero.
this is your,
Degree 0.
I don't have an answer to
No?
this question.
I don't.
no, you don't, it's
you
all right.
mention- could you say it in Spanish?
I want to know
Can you ask
if
again?
it's
Is
a,
there-
di-
Can you ask
if it's a
that
dial.
question in Russian?
Well, I
If
think it's
it's a
annoying.
dial.
I think it's annoying to be loud.
Thank you for the question.
And therefore,
But if it's a dial, right? I wonder. This is the type of, I mean, I don't think that we have positions anymore, but maybe we do have tunes. And we have playlists, and we have preferences, and we have likes,
But maybe I don't care
that
as much
good?
about
Is that good?
decibel. Like
don't
I
have
don't
any of
care so
that.
much
Good?
about decibel, but I care about the quality of sound.
Okay, so as long as it's kind of beautiful and warm, then.
Yeah, it may not be the music that I like even.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.